And finally, we'd like to give you an overview of the rest of the toolkit. And while the methodology can be applied wholesale to an institution, it's also intended as a modular system from which you might select different bits to use. And there are sections geared to all aspects of the museum and heritage site, including collecting, cataloguing, displaying, exhibiting, tours, education, and finally, public engagement.
So let's think first about collecting. Now, since collections feed into research and exhibitions and interpretation and public programming, they are basically the starting point for any museum that wants to reflect the diversity and the complexity of the populations that they represent. But one of the main problems that museums face in trying to represent women and LGBTQ+ people is that those groups are often poorly represented in existing collections. In the past, this has been because collecting and acquisition practices have tended to privilege men, meaning that other groups have been marginalised or hidden from collections or from history.
As we've tried to show in our case studies, most collections will contain objects that can be interpreted in a gendered way. But if you want your collection to be developed further, making it easier to tell these stories, you might want to consider some of the following options. You might want to be involved in proactive collecting. In other words, prioritising items that fill certain gaps in your collections. You might want to look at your acquisition policies so that you recognise gender and sexuality as important categories when acquiring gifts or bequests. And finally, you might want to seek advice. An advisory board can often help to develop an inclusive collecting framework which takes account of the sensitivity of these stories. Reach out, for example, to local LGBTQ+ groups or to charities or even to universities.
How about cataloguing? Now, catalogues are what shape knowledge. They determine what can be located, what can be seen, and what can be told about objects. And so how they handle gender and sexuality can therefore have pretty far-reaching effects. As it stands, gender and sexuality are pretty rarely searchable terms in catalogue metadata relating to producers, owners, commissioners, and benefactors. Catalogues and cataloguing processes in some instances render women anonymous. There's often no easy way to search across collections for women as makers, designers, or owners, for example. And similarly, the LGBTQ+ significance of an object is often far from obvious, particularly if the object was produced in a context where discussion of LGBTQ+ experience was constrained.
In the short term, you might want to consider some of the following ideas. Now, firstly, you might consider producing finding aids. In other words, you'd go through the existing collection and you'd produce guides that highlight particular materials that are relevant to women, to gender, and to sexuality. Now, short, user-friendly guides are an incredibly helpful way for visitors and staff alike to navigate what are often very complex cataloguing systems and very dense collections. They're often almost impenetrable for the outsider. And secondly, you might also want to introduce tags or categories. And this can be one useful way to make objects relating to women or LGBTQ+ people clearly identifiable on collections databases. For example, the Victoria and Albert Museum used the category tags LGBTQ+ and gender and sexuality. Now, of course, you won't be able to tag all relevant objects at once. That's okay. Start small, take half an hour a week to tag a few relevant objects, and gradually you'll increase the visibility of these groups in your collections. Now, thirdly, it's also important that you think about terminology. Apply the correct terminology concerning gender and sexuality sensitively and accurately. And a very good starting point for this is to use the vocabulary of LGBTQ terms developed by the V&A. And you can find this referenced in the section at the end of the toolkit on researching the history of gender. In the longer term, Consider working towards developing cataloguing systems that integrate gender and sexuality into categorization.